Well, welcome everybody to another conversation about carbon. My name is Joe Coletti. I'm the Senior Associate Dean in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences and will be moderating this session today. And I'm glad that you can join us for this important set of discussions around carbon and particularly ag carbon in this case. I have the pleasure to, along with my colleagues Azrin Chrisman-Daughter and Ali Kraber, to will be asking you if you do have questions towards the end on the Q&A question and answer part to put those in the chat. And so please engage in that way. And then on this screen shot that you have, you see that there are the recordings, the schedule, and then the updates. So visit those sites and keep connected. It's my distinct pleasure today to introduce a friend and a colleague, and really one of our top scientists from Iowa State, Dr. Lois Wright Morton. She is a professor emeritus from our sociology department. She's an outstanding scientist, and she's a seventh generation farmer to boot. So she not only knows the science, but she applies the science. She has numerous dozens of different awards and honors. I'll just highlight one that in 2016, the USDA NIFA Partnership Award was given to her and really the team that she led on a project that we know as the Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation in Corn-Based Cropping Systems. It's really been a pleasure to work with for many years and to learn from Lois. She's been instrumental in a lot of heartland of the Midwest research around water quality, and also led our very impactful about a 6-year project, a coordinated ag project, a $20 million funded project with USDA, where it was really about this climate change mitigation adaptation of corn-based cropping systems. She understands the science around team science. She understands convergence science. She understands and she applies transdisciplinary research. So I think also she'll probably be talking a little bit about her connection to the land in the farmer arena, and also with her connections to solutions from the land. So without further ado, let me introduce that she'll be, her title of her presentation is Connecting Agricultural Carbon to Sustainable Development Goals. I'm going to stop sharing now, Lois.
Okay.
There we go.
All righty. Okay, is that a good vision? Can everyone see that?
It's perfect.
I want to thank you for.
Thank you, Lois.
Yep, thank you. I want to thank you for sharing your lunch with me. I did have the opportunity on March 10th to listen in to the Carbon Removal Forum that sort of kicked off this conversation about carbon research. And I want to take just a little bit of time today to talk about the connection as we think about the science of carbon reduction and removal in agriculture, the role of farmers, landowners, ranchers, foresters, those who practice the management of the land. That has a large impact on what the carbon looks like and how we do some adaptation and mitigation. I want to step back for just a minute and start out saying that there's never been a greater need for agriculture renaissance. We've altered the landscape on every continent. We've done it in order to feed ourselves, to clothe ourselves. We depend on these resources for our survival, but we're rapidly depleting the soils, the lakes, the rivers, the forests. And this is not new news to those of you that are listening. In 2015, the United Nations developed the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, intended to set forward a destination for us as humans as we work through the issues of living on our planet. In a few minutes, I'll talk a little bit about those Sustainable Development Goals. 2030 is not very far away, and we have yet to make the progress that we'd like to progress. Um, I will be talking about two things today. One of them will be the solutions from the land report, the 21st century renaissance that Dr. Coletti just referenced. That is a farmer report that really encompasses what we think of as the future of agriculture and what are some of the roles that farmers and the agricultural value chain can contribute. But before we move to that, I want to talk a little bit about the farmers' roles in these conversations. And overlying all of this is, what are the critical conversations that we should be having about food, agriculture, and natural resources? It's really easy for us to focus. I shouldn't say it's really easy. Those of you that are doing carbon research, there's nothing easy about that. But know that that carbon is only part of the entire planet system, and it's an important part of that system that is part of our conversation. But we need to enlarge that conversation to think about that as a larger system. So I want to start out with thinking about farmers. And as Dr. Coletti said, I spent most of my academic career asking, what are farmers thinking? Why do they do the things they do? Why are they, how are they addressing water quality problems? How are they addressing soil erosion? You know, we have a lot of science that we've developed over the years that tells us what are some of the things we can do, no-till cover crops. I mean, there's a lot of technologies and approaches, and yet not all farmers are doing that. They're adapting and adopting some technologies, but not others. And so I've spent my entire career asking, well, why are they doing some things and not other things? And you're not intended to look at all those. What I just want to show you is that that's a lot of words, a lot of theory, a lot of things that I'm thinking about. You know, what are farmers doing and why are they doing it? And I have to tell you, when I retired in 2017, and I retired primarily to farm in Northeast Ohio, which is where my family settled about 200 years ago. And my intention really was to have a small scale farm, diversified production system, making good use of not only selling my product wholesale, but also local farmers markets. You can see that I've got hardwood forests, so intending to deal with some of the fragmentation of landscapes. And I also have corn and soybeans that I do cost share in partnership with my brother, and use a lot of his outputs, his manure and oat crops in kind of a circular economy way as inputs for my mulch and for my nutrients. But the big thing I want you to take away is that something that we as scientists forget, and that is that it's not easy to farm. It's really easy from the outside looking in and say, oh, well, you ought to do this. Our science tells you you should do this. Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing this? And all of a sudden, I began to realize that, in fact, it's not as simple as just telling me, here's the science, you ought to do it, and I ought to do it. It's a little more complicated than that. And I want to, in a couple of slides, I'll actually show you how I've moved to thinking of it. But I want to go back to the social science research that's happened over the last couple of decades. We have not been idle. Linda Prokopi out of Purdue University has led a group of scientists looking at meta-analysis, asking what are the factors that influence farmer decision-making, and basically concluded in both a 2008 and a 2019 analysis that there are few independent variables that consistently, significantly predict that farmers will adopt conservation practices. That's a little bit discouraging. We've used a whole variety of theories, the theory of planned behavior, value norms, adoption diffusion. They'll explain some things in some situations, but there's no consistency to them. And my conclusion, after looking at much of that and my own career, is that our current theories are narrow and insufficient to really represent the scope of complexity that we see when farmers are trying to make decisions within a coupled human natural systems relationships. And that's what we're really talking about. This is a systems relationship. It's not a very simple kind of thing. One consistent message that we have found on our climate change and adaptation research is that trusted advisors and the language that we use when we talk about climate change really matters. It matters whether, it helps farmers think about it and understand it. A word of caution that makes me just a little bit concerned is that we then take that finding and in some instances misapply it. We sort of have in our minds that, oh, okay, so it's just how we create the message. We just have to find the right person to deliver what we know as scientists is right, and voila, farmers will do that. That's called social engineering. And I have to tell you, when you think about a systems relationship, that's really way too simplistic and really doesn't get you to where we need to be. It's a misapplication, I think, of social science. That's kind of my view. And what I want to encourage us as researchers and as extension outreach educators to be careful that we don't treat science to outreach to practice as a linear process, because it's not a linear process. The fact that we think we're the experts and we just have to get farmers to do the right things that we know are right doesn't actually take us to where we need to be. And I think we need to go back to thinking about what does social science do? How does social science partner with the biophysical, the atmospheric side? What the kind of science that we're doing in a multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary way. And that suggests to me that we're interested in farmers, not just what they're thinking, but how they manage in this complex human natural system, and how we might help them do a better job in balancing their day-to-day and long-term activities, not just to meet societal goals, but their own goals. And one of their first primary goals, they have to make a profit in order to stay in business. And so when you begin to ask what is it that they're thinking, it's not just about economics, but it's how profitability and how they manage those particular relationships. So let's talk for just a quick minute about what sustainable development goals are. In other words, what might be societal goals? I talked a little bit about the farmer goals, his occupation, her occupation, in order to stay in business. But as I said earlier, the United Nations was very concerned about humanity, particularly these sustainable development goals are particularly focused on developing countries, countries that have poverty, have high hunger rates. They're learning ways to actually use their resources. They have very limited resources. And so one of the questions that we as the United States and as a very successful history of agricultural enterprise need to be asking, how can what we've learned and what we know, the research that we've done not only in the past and the practice of agriculture, but the research that we're doing into the future now that will have implications, solve some of these problems of poverty, hunger, health and nutrition, climate issues, water quality issues, all of these. And one of the things that we're learning very, very clearly, both the United Nations and the countries as we try to work with these goals, is to realize that we can't focus on just one. We can't just focus on food insecurity. We can't just focus on solving the climate issues and greenhouse gas. We can't just focus on energy. We have to think about these in a system way, because the education, all of these that are part of a system. And one way to think about this is to think about what are the key social and economic outcomes of integrating some of those goals, that agriculture and forestry are essential in partnership. And so if you just take the idea of reducing hunger and improving nutrition, that means that we have to build capacity of our farmers and our agricultural chain. We have to deal with this knowledge dissemination, technologies, research, thinking about nutritional quality. And you can see that it's wrapped up in a very, very complex way in order to create these quality livelihoods that farmers can stay profitable, not just in the United States. Sometimes we as farmers in the United States think, well, it's about us staying profitable and staying in business, and it is. But if you think of a developed country, that that are working on less than a hectare of land or quarter hectare or something, they're making a livelihood out of that and trying to deal with their food insecurity of their family. So it's very, very complicated. And we've layered on top of that something really important, and that's the ecosystems, the soil, water, forests of our planet, which are necessary for us as humans to continue to thrive. So it's a complex thing when we start to ask, why are farmers doing some of the things that they do, and why aren't they doing the things that seem so obvious to us? The key attributes of the future, as we think about the research that we might be doing in social science and linking to the kinds of things we're learning in the biophysical science, really are the fact that there's episodic change. Not only do we have climate change and weather and temperature and water, but we have political upheaval. We have a lot of market change, unpredictability. We've just been through 2020. I don't think I have to tell you the kinds of things and uncertainty that have created an upheaval that perhaps we might not have thought about. And our resilience is a very, very great word, but achieving it is a real challenge. And that brings me to this need for new models of human natural systems, models that actually I think of as having social learning at the center of that really encourages us to experiment, innovate, to address the productivity of the food system, but also the profitability of those that participate, and this notion of retaining, recycling, and enhancing our resources in a circular economy way in order to protect our natural resource quality. I don't have time today to spend elaborating this, but this is one of the models that I've begun to work through. I had the opportunity to publish this in 2020 in the Soil and Water Conservation Celebration of 75 years. There's a chapter on that talking about social understanding and expectations that really focuses on thinking about system level, putting social sciences into models that are system level models in order to have a better understanding of how social learning of the farmer, the landowner, the behavior that we need in order to achieve some of those sustainable development goals. So really quickly, what does social learning look like from a farmer's point of view? And I want to share with you what I think is a really beautiful example of what farmer social learning might look like. We see this on the leading edge of farmers as they're trying to integrate the farmer production, climate, all of those kinds of things that we need to achieve those goals. And this is a farmer, Trey Hill from Maryland, that actually is part of our Solutions from the Land team and has been part of our conversations about what does the future farmer look like. And I love this statement that he makes. They're sustainable, they're resilient, ecologically minded, climate smart, regenerative, and a smart business person. And then of course he said that they're an artist on the landscape, which entails of an emotional experience. He talks about the future of farming and what that might look like, reminds us that it's not a straight delineated way, but an ecological landscape, and farming it has a flow to it that's different than the way we've traditionally farmed. And he tells the story about when he first wanted to farm. This was what it looked like, his fields looked like when he farmed with his dad. And he loved the idea of what the soil felt like under his feet. And, you know, it smelled really good. I remember when I moved to Iowa and I had 10 acres and I got my plow out and I plowed for the first time the Iowa soil. And it was totally an awesome experience. I totally understand why seeing that fresh soil turned over and smelling it in the spring is an exciting and satisfying personal relationship that we have with the soil. And his point is that farming is an experience. And he has moved to an ecological way of farming. And this is what his farms look like. And he's actually planting corn in a cover crop here. He's rolled it and crimped it. And now he's actually planting corn. He'll later on spray it. But he says, now the experience is I feel the soft soil, I feel his crops, the flowers, I see bugs and bees, I see something different. And it's a different experience. And this sort of reminds me as a social science that the farmers that we're working with, it's not just profit, it's not just their values, it's an emotional investment in how they take care of the land. And that really matters. And so he's actually saying this is a different kind of experience that I had as a kid that made me want to become a farmer. But I've learned that I have to change how to do it, and I'm doing it sustainably. And I'm doing it by embracing ecology and trying to complement it rather than trying to control it. And so the takeaway that is that sustainability is financial, it's climate, it's social, it's environmental, it's emotional. There's just lots of things going on when we begin to think about how we take the science of removing carbon from the soil, removing it from the atmosphere, the things that we're doing. We have to think about what are the actions and what are the motivations of why people are doing that. And that leads really nicely into this report, Solutions from the Land, this 21st Century Agriculture report that a few scientists have put, or excuse me, a few farmers have put together as we've been asking ourselves, how can we farm better as we move into the 21st century? Farming's been a very successful operation for many, many years as we moved from mules and from to the plow to the tractor. I mean, we've got all kinds of innovations as we've learned and as our science has told us the things that are going on. And so I think the question now to farmers is, how can we deliver multiple benefits, not just food, not just food security, not just fuel, but how can we deliver clean water? How can we deliver greenhouse gas removal, sequestration? How can we deliver the many things that we're asking our farmers to do? And this report really talks about the principles. It's Solutions from the Land is an NGO that's focused. We operate both in the United States, but we're also doing work with the Climate Change Committee, FAO. An hour ago, I just got off of this Zoom with the World Bank, talking with them a little bit about innovation and some of the solutions that farmers can bring in solving the multiple challenges that we're facing. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because I want to leave some time for questions. But one of the things that we talk about is that there's a whole set of solution pathways, and they require a new way of thinking. Just like Trey was talking about, you know what? I have to change the way that I'm thinking. The way my farmer thought, or my father thought, my grandfather thought, that worked for his time and period and for what we knew. We now know the harm that we've done to our water and to our soils. And we now know another way, a better way of farming and co-producing these ecosystem services that are so important beyond just producing food and some of the things that we're doing. It takes an uncommon set of collaborations, innovation, in order to address some of those sustainable development goals. This is kind of our guiding model that we use. We're focused. This is our climate smart agriculture model. We're focused on productivity, the sustainable intensification, the concept that, quite honestly, the earth is already using the land that's available for productivity. There isn't more land to bring into production. So we have to use the land that we have. And in fact, we're using some land, acreage and hectares that actually shouldn't be in crops or in row crops, but should be in more sustainable perennial kinds of landscapes. We're looking at adaptation and resilience and greenhouse gas reduction and thinking of them in the system way. And what you see are our pathways and our tactics. The report talks a little bit about that, talks about the principles of farmers implementing this systems approach. And the key to this systems approach is much of the policy making that has been happening in agriculture happens without asking farmers, without involving them in the conversation. It happens very often much higher in the agricultural value chain, or it actually happens in a public policy forum with people who actually don't even know how to grow crops and what farmers are doing and what it would take in order to achieve the goals that they'd like. Here are our high priority system level actions. We talk about them in the report. The idea of diversified, sustainable, intensified strategies, managing the water cycle, special attention to growing nutritious foods. It's not enough anymore to just produce calories to ensure food security. We need to be producing calories and nutritious food that change the health that we have. Markets for ecosystem services, being sure that we can measure our goals and our metrics, this financial and technical assistance, building on farmers, involving them in our research, and modernizing our information networks. In conclusion, here is the takeaway from both thinking about the social science, how we put that into our research, and thinking about how we bring farmers into the policy conversation, into our research conversations, to make better decisions and to actually move forward in a way that we need to. And I've just given you 4 bullet points that are sort of want you to be thinking about. We have to do our research science on a system by systems basis. I know we need the micro level, we need foundational science. I'm not saying we don't need the foundational sciences, but at some point we have to put them together in the system in which they work, and humans are part of that system. So we need to be thinking about what that looks like, and more than thinking, we need to be actually experimenting with it. And that means that farmers, rather than just being on our advisory boards or just saying, okay, here's the science here, what do you think of it? Give it a try. They need to be our partners as we ask the research questions, as we develop our design and the methods we select, and more importantly, how we interpret and use those findings. Very often we have really sound science, and I'm talking social science. We might find some of have some very solid, we might have run the numbers right, but the application of that finding, we may be misapplying some of those findings in a way that are not where they ought to be. And lastly, I just want to say that the agriculture renaissance is underway, but there's so much we don't know. At the top of this slide, I have Iowa Smart Agriculture. We have a group of farmers that Solutions from the Land is working with in Iowa. You would be amazed at these thought leaders and the kinds of leading edge innovations that they're doing on their farms. I not only amazed, but the things that we can learn from them is pretty remarkable. I have found them a terrific team. And that is it. I'm 3 minutes over, Azaron. What do you think? What questions do you have?
Thank you, Lois. This was really excellent. There's a couple of questions in the chat. I'll just go ahead and start with the first one. says you did an excellent job laying out this idea that communicating with farmers is not easy, and all the new ideas and practices we have. Could you take a minute and reflect from your research and expertise the best way to communicate to farmers the idea of adapting new practices, not just to help their pocketbooks, but also mitigate climate change? And I know you've sort of alluded to some of that in your talk here, but what advice can you give so we can all be better communicators in this space?
Okay, well, it would be nice to be able to say that we should just develop a good message, right? And we do need to develop new messages. We're in the extension, we're in the business of thinking about how do we convey the science that we have, and so that people understand it, and the knowledge piece. I think I think one of the very first things that we have to do is to listen to what farmers are telling us. Now, here's the thing. Farmers are different. They're growing different crops. I have to tell you, I'm growing blueberries. That's a perennial. Red raspberries. It's not at all like growing corn and soybeans for a whole kinds of things. The crop physiology, I mean, just everything about that's different. So when we want them to adopt practices, cover crops is just as appropriate to both of those kinds of. So we need to be listening to what the farmer is telling us, learning about what the resources they have, what are the resources they need, and then being sure that they have access to the knowledge and the information. So lots of times the technology is there, the information is there, but there's a human resistance to trying something new. When I already have something that I know is working, there actually is a momentum. It's a physics thing, is a momentum thing that it takes time and energy to change and to rethink what that is. So it's a system kind of thing, and it's a long-term thing. They won't immediately change the first time they hear it. So we have to keep giving that message that cover crops work in many situations. They won't work in all situations. We have to have a whole set of tools, a whole set of options, and let the farmer think about, with help, with technical help and with support, what are my options? What are the options that are on the table that I could directly apply to the cropping systems that I have? So we need lots of tools, not just one.
Azrin and Lois, before we go to the next question from Madi Al-Casey, one of the things that has struck me in this whole conversations about carbon is that could you talk a bit about should we be just focused on new carbon only, the carbon that would be cycled by plants and into the soil and back from the soil, then how to sequester? Or is there going to be always a role for the old carbon, all the plants and animals that died millions of years ago that have given us all the coal, the oil, the natural gas? Could you speak a bit about that?
Well, now you're talking to a social scientist.
Your view is important.
So Madi Al-Casey probably would do a better job of answering that question. But we have to retain the carbon that we have first. A lot of the research shows how much carbon we've lost when we turned the soil over and with the invention of the plow, right? We lost a lot of carbon. And so we do need to gain some of that back. So we have to be paying attention to both new carbon and retaining and managing the carbon that we have, and managing it well. I'm reminded yesterday, our Iowa Smart Ag farmer group met, and Lisa was on, and she said something that I've just been thinking about for the last 24 hours. That she said, when we began cover crops research, and I'll probably get this wrong and misquote her, so she might have to say it again, but that the cover crop research began in the 80s and 90s. And if you go back even further, we were doing cover crops in the 30s and 40s. I mean, if you think about it, cover crops have been around a long time, and then we set them aside, and then we've come back into them. But this actually doing the science of what they do and how they help us in retaining carbon and even building new carbon. And so we need, and what she said was, so we need to be doing the new models now in order to get us forward. We can't just say we've done cover crops and we've solved the problem. It's going to take a lot more strategies than simply cover crops. Cover crops are great, but they don't work for everybody. And so we have to not be content with that.
You're muted.
You're muted.
With myself. Could you share your views about the potential of rethinking the future Farm Bill language to have a framework that includes the social components in advancing climate smart agricultural system among farmers?
Oh, wow. Is that like thinking into the future optimistically? I think there is an increasing awareness that the human aspect of this coupled natural system is really, really important. And I am somewhat encouraged. Solutions from the Land has actually been, has shared our report with the new Secretary of Ag and many of their staff. And we're beginning to have the conversation about bringing farmers into these conversations. And so the Farm Bill language is not just about bringing social science research in, which I would very much encourage. So if we're funding additional biophysical science, which is totally needed on all these new technologies and the things that we're learning, it should be all of the sciences that might contribute to that. But I want to move even further than that. I think there should be some language that farmers are more deeply involved in the forming of that Farm Bill and thinking about how those incentives and thinking about both market incentives as well as public policy. I'm not saying that we spend more, that the Farm Bill, but I think there's a huge need for technical support in order, back to your original question, if we're going to change practices and help farmers learn a different way to do things, they need a huge amount of technical support. And we need to find ways to give them that. And it may also mean resources to purchase. If we're doing a diversified livestock cropping system, that means that they need resources to buy new fencing. We've gotten rid of most of the fences, and if you're only doing crops, right? So when we think about new systems, new diversified systems, that means that we're reorganizing our landscape in a way that there'll be capital investments, there'll be human investments, and very, very much we need this coupled research that puts together this transdisciplinary work.
Thank you. Question here on, in your experience, how can transdisciplinary teams support and facilitate research and extension in this area?
Oh, the really, I'm not good at saying things really quickly. I've been told that. So probably the most important thing in a transdisciplinary, I'm calling it a research team, but is to put extension front and center of that conversation. So one of the things that we did in our sustainable corn project was to spend a lot of time thinking about our audience of farmers and extension, working with those farmers to bring in their questions about what's the research that we need to know, what works with the practices and what don't they work. Too often the extension component is left to deliver the science in that linear way that I talked about. And so not just do farmers need to be involved in that kind of the system level research, but our extension and those that are training our next generation of scientists need to be part of that. The biophysical science is really important, but we need to be careful that it doesn't totally drive. None of those should be driving it. It should be a team collaborative effort.
Great, thank you. Joe, do you want to do a question, or shall I do the next one?
So Lois, I'll do the next one.
You mentioned the need to focus not just on calories, but also on nutrition. Could you expand a bit more on what you mean?
Um, yes. Uh, one of the uh, and now I guess what I want to think about global nutrition, global health. One of the conversations that have come out of our discussions with FAO and with uh, uh, some of our partners when we talk about food security is this idea of nutrition. And we have a lot of undernourished individuals. We have those in the United States and in developing countries. We also have an obesity epidemic, a huge obesity epidemic, and we've exported it. If you want to take the responsibility for it, I don't know if we want to take the responsibility for it, but we've all the countries of the world, even the developing country, poor developing countries also have obesity problems. And we know that there's not a direct relationship between, in many instances, between obesity and and income. In other words, health. So we need to be paying attention to the kinds of foods that we're producing, that they're affordable, nutritious. And one of the research opportunities is to take many of the foods that we are producing and find ways to enhance them. And now again, I'm way out of, I'm not a nutritionist or a food researcher, but I know that we've spent a huge amount of time of looking for ways with rice and enhancing the nutritional value of rice. I know many of our fruits and vegetables, the way they're grown actually influences the nutritional level of them. And so we need to be thinking about not just producing a particular food, but thinking about the climate or the context in which it's produced and the health that it provides when it moves from a raw to a process. So it's part of the food chain also.
And this question is from our own Dr. Lisa Schulte Moore. There's some discussion that other types of professionals keep taking farmer jobs away from them. So they're specialists in seed development, fertility, marketing, and so on. And also there's a discussion that even researchers and extension people are taking the jobs away from farmers. So this is Lisa saying, since she's a researcher, what do you see as good ways or good examples of farmers and scientists working together where farmers still are in a leading role? It seems to me that Solutions for the Land really speaks to this directly.
Yeah. The context of that one, that's a complicated question because we as researchers, that's our day job. We're paid to do that. And when and I've actually thought about this a little bit, and I don't really know what the answer is, but I know when we reach out to farmers and we ask them to be part of our research and involved with that, it takes a lot of time. I have to tell you that I retired to farming, but I'm still on a couple of projects that involve farmers, right? And I'm thinking to myself, whoa, how do I have time to farm if I'm all engaged in this research that's happening? And so we have to find, I think, financial incentives in some way that help with that partnership, because there's a cost involved for a farmer to do that. Now, part of that is I'm thinking of the one that Mark Gleason and I are doing on cucurbits, that we involve specialty crop growers that are growing them. Our project is actually purchasing the mesonets, purchasing the equipment and the technologies that will be needed for them to try and experiment with that. And so what we've done is take away the cost risk of that infrastructure. And in return, what they're giving us back is their time and their expertise. So I think it's finding a trade, may not be a monetary trade, but recognizing that every time we as researchers involve a farmer and just even an advisory role, a quarterly advisory role that takes 2 hours. And when do we have them? We have them in the middle of the time when I ought to be out in the field. All of those annoying things that I never thought of until people want Zoom meetings. And I'm thinking, I need to be out picking blueberries. I need to be out pruning. I need to be doing other things. So those kinds of things go through farmers' minds too. So we need to be thinking about, and farmers can help us know what that trait is. But lots of times, one of the things that we can do as we're writing grants is that we're actually putting into our budgets money that actually purchases some of the experimental technologies that farmers need. And then that's the hook, that's the advantage of bringing them in.
Thank you very much, Lois. I think these are all the questions we have time to go through today. Joe, do you have any closing words?
I just want to thank all the participants and that have been listening and also sending in questions. And Lois, thank you very much for a systems view from a social platform. You know, I think this conversation about carbon is really pretty wonderful. And there is information that Ali just put in the chat that our own Dr. Mahdi El-Casey will be the next speaker of this conversations about carbon on May 5th. So same noon hour for Iowa. And hopefully there'll be a lot of people that will join again on that. So again, thanks to everybody. Go out and think about old carbon, new carbon systems, and getting engaged with farmers, but in more maybe uncommon but appropriate ways. Thank you very much.